Here's Konfrontasi, Australia's Secret War Part 2.
It was going across the border, knowing that you were participating in a highly secret operation, and knowing that you were participating in a cross-border operation with a country with whom Australia wasn't officially at war.
Well, most of that didn't really concern me. I was simply doing my job. In hindsight, to me, it seemed to be very risky to send 30 men into Indonesia with the possibility of them getting into a firefight, had any men captured or killed. Explaining to the Australian public how this happened inside Indonesia could have been a bit embarrassing to the government.
The Australian government had in fact been reluctant to commit troops to Borneo. Prime Minister Menzies had supported the creation of Malaysia, but during the early stages of confrontation, Menzies held out against strong pressure from both London and Kuala Lumpur to provide military aid.
The biggest factor from the Australian government's point of view was that once confrontation was dealt with, that we should be able to re-establish normal relations with our largest and most populous neighbour to our immediate near north. The Australian government's policy up to 1965 was very much that yes, military force might well be needed, but not yet. And despite the pleas of the Malaysian and British governments on several occasions, particularly in the course of 1964, as Sukarno's promise that it would be a year of living dangerously seemed to be more and more coming to pass, the Australian government continued to say yes, but not yet, essentially, until after the major incursions in the latter part of that year made it fairly clear that that was not a policy which would be tenable for very much longer.
In the past few months, more than 250 Indonesian regular troops have been landed or airdropped into southern Malaya.
Sukarno's paratroopers dropped into the Borneo jungle, but met a swift end as Malay troops mopped them up. A petty war, but in the perilous 60s, any war is a worldwide danger.
It was mainly Sukarno who escalated the confrontation. The British had started applying more pressure on Indonesia, as I said, but in September 1964, Sukarno really upped the stakes. Up until that point, Indonesia had been sending troops and guerrillas into Borneo, part of Malaysia. But now they openly sent troops into Malaya, Peninsula Malaya. And the British promised to Malaysians, if this carried on, they would start bombing targets in Indonesia. And the British started moving out large numbers of bombers, other planes, ships and troops to region in readiness for open war against Indonesia.
The answer to this question could well decide the difference between confrontation and war in 1965.
Both Britain and Indonesia backed away at the last moment from open war. But even before the paratroop raids on the Malaysian mainland, Britain had decided to pursue a range of covert countermeasures against Indonesian confrontation. These ranged from black propaganda to cross-border military raids and secret support for separatist movements within Indonesia. What you're about to hear now is some top-secret advice which was sent from the Foreign Office to Cabinet in January of 1964. It's now been declassified, and it gives us a fascinating insight into the British strategy.
As long as our conflict with Indonesia remains unofficial and bilateral, we retain the initiative. We can choose either to intensify it or to seek a settlement. Once we either internationalize it or turn it into a war, declared or undeclared, against a wicked aggressor, Her Majesty's government will be restricted in their freedom of action, both by public opinion at home and international pressure.
And international pressure, which the Foreign Office was worried about, was in fact pressure from one of Britain's own closest allies, the United States.
Although the Americans were getting very alarmed at other countries and other radical nationalists who were not quite communists but seemed to be too close to the communists, in the case of Indonesia they took a very different line, and they were much more inclined to take an attitude which the Australians at times characterised as appeasement. In other words, they were willing to buy Sukarno off if it meant keeping him out of the communist camp. And the Indonesians played on this very skillfully. The Americans were much more inclined to go along with that, and they said, look, you Commonwealth powers, Australia, Britain, New Zealand, you can handle Sukarno, you can keep him under control without too much military effort.
At the time, Britain portrayed Indonesia as the aggressor and Malaysia as the victim of confrontation. Britain argued that she was simply defending the nation she'd helped to create against Sukarno's ambitions to dominate the region. But according to David Easter, the real story is a very different one. Easter has done extensive research in the archives and interviewed former officials about British aims. He says that the evidence he's gathered doesn't support the official account. In reality, says Easter, Britain pursued an aggressive war against Indonesia without the knowledge of the British public.
The British decided in '64 that they couldn't just remain defensive, they couldn't just try and stop the Indonesian guerrilla raids. They thought the war could go on indefinitely at higher and higher levels of cost for Britain. So they started trying to adopt a policy of attrition, try and gradually put pressure on Indonesia to try and force it to give up confrontation. The Foreign Office described at one point repaying Indonesians in kind, doing back to them what they were doing to Malaysia. And the British saw the way they could try and perhaps end this conflict, to try and squeeze the Indonesians in return, that would force eventually Sukarno or maybe the military to back down and stop confrontation.
So, David Easter, are you saying then that in a sense both Britain and Indonesia were in a sense willing and active partners in confrontation? It wasn't just something made by Sukarno?
It was in a way a mutual confrontation. The British, as I said, weren't just flying a defensive, they were actually aggressively attacking Indonesia. But again, in a very secret way, in terms of propaganda and covert action, cross-border raids, to try and put the squeeze on the Indonesians. The British called it a policy of moral attrition, to try and grind down the Indonesians, increase tensions within the country, to try and defeat the guerrillas on the border, on their side of the border, and therefore force Indonesia to back down.
You're listening to Hindsight on ABC Radio National. And today, the story of our secret war with Indonesia.
It was a fascinating time and a very challenging time for Australian diplomacy, because you should remember that at this time Australia's whole foreign policy and defence policy was based on the idea of forward defence, which basically meant keeping allied to the greatest extent possible with both Britain and the United States. People sometimes think that we'd changed over from Britain to the US in the 40s. That certainly wasn't the case. So there was the sense that this was really Britain's show, and we did not want to be put too much into the front line.
Australia was by no means a purely passive player in what was an increasingly risky and potentially explosive diplomatic game. Our two major allies were pulling in quite different directions, but we managed to balance ourselves between them.
But it was not just a matter of balancing our lives, that was a major part of it. But there was a very strong sense, particularly the diplomats in external affairs, that they wanted to make a truly Australian policy, which was influenced by alliance relationships, but not determined by alliance relationships. They were also determined to figure out a policy which was in Australia's national interests and in Australia's long-term national interests.
With increasing Australian military involvement in Malaysia, do you think Indonesia will modify its confrontation?
Well, the government has followed a policy of a graduated response in this area. And more recently, as you heard last night, we have agreed to supply personnel and equipment to Malaysian forces.
Sir Garfield Barwick, who was then Minister for External Affairs, announcing the first deployment of Australian forces to Borneo in 1964. Those forces were to provide support for British and Malaysian troops and were to be used in a strictly defensive capacity. But in February 1965, Prime Minister Menzies announced that combat troops would be sent to Borneo. Opinion polls at the time showed that there was broad support amongst the Australian public. But what the public didn't know was what these troops would really be doing.
Well, opposite us was siding the Indonesian border camp. That was the equivalent to our position on our side of the border. And it was supplied by boats running up and down a river. And the idea was that we would get across and ambush the river and see if we could slow down their resupply.
But also, obviously, to put some military pressure on them to let them know that you were prepared to conduct offensive operations.
Oh, yes, yes.
Pat Beale, who led a platoon from the 3rd Royal Australian Regiment across the border in May 1965. It was the first ambush operation by Australian troops in Borneo.
Being the first operation, I think there was a great degree of caution used in mounting it. We travelled down a ridge line for a distance of about 4 kilometres, I suppose it was, very slowly and very cautiously, as it seemed such an obviously ideal approach for anybody trying to get to the river, that we suspected that the Indonesians may well have it either patrolled or have mined it or put some sort of block along it at some stage, so we took it very slowly and very cautiously.
And you actually, as you were moving along the track there, you found an Indonesian cigarette packet, which caused you a bit of wry amusement, I think, didn't it?
It was from the English-American Tobacco Company, I think was the label on it, specially packaged for the Indonesian Armed Forces. We slipped away fairly early in the morning, went down very cautiously to the river, and found that instead of it being, as we expected, a nice empty stretch of the riverline, that we could move in at our leisure and put an ambush in position, that in fact it was another Indonesian base area. There was probably at least an Indonesian platoon just at the spot that we wanted to lay the ambush. And there was a lot of movement, a lot of noise, the occasional rifle shot. Presumably they were out hunting. And instead of into a deserted area, it was like coming into Pitt Street.
The next morning, Pat Beale decided to go ahead with the ambush.
It was really more in the nature of a raid. It wouldn't be a long, deliberate ambush that we could have expected to have kept in position for days. So we decided to go back into the same area, cross the track, go down to the riverbank, hit whatever came along the river, and then get back out as quickly as possible, hoping that nobody came along behind us along that track. And so we moved into position and waited there for about 40 minutes, and along came 4 boats that we were able to engage. As the boats came down the river, there was a lot of yelling and talking, and the soldiers from the Indonesian camp that was just on the other side of the river wandered down to call out to their mates in the boats. So we had quite a crowd. The 4 boats, each with about 5 in them. The lead 2 boats came into the ambush area. We engaged them, and also the Indonesian soldiers on the other bank. We were able to sink the 4 boats and inflict casualties on a number of the Indonesian soldiers on the other bank.
One of the soldiers actually leapt into the water and swam away, and you had a moment there where suddenly you found you couldn't go on firing, yeah?
Yes, yes. One poor little bugger was sort of slugging around in the water trying to get away from our fire, and I eventually found that it was... I'm not a good shot at the best of times, but I was probably worse than I ever was. And that was really to my relief. I didn't like to sort of be quite as callous as it seemed, shooting this poor bloke swimming away. Unfortunately, he was seen by others in the ambush and at his end.
Were you under fire too while this was going on?
Oh yeah, the Indonesian soldiers on the other bank, as soon as they had recovered from the initial burst of fire, started firing back at us, and it became quite intense. quite a gun battle across the river line.
But what was the end result of that gun battle then?
Well, once the boats had been sunk, our job was finished, and we really needed to get out of there as quickly as we possibly could.
Neil took his platoon back across the border without casualties. A few days later, they discovered that the Indonesians had chosen to suppress all news of the Australian ambush.
Well, this fairly routinely was mentioned on some Indonesian radio station a couple of days later, saying that there had been a training accident and that a group of Indonesians, I forget really the number now, I think it was probably 13 that they credited us with, had been killed in this training accident. They never confirmed that it was on their side of the border. And of course that was the whole irony of these Claret operations, that they were kept very secure and very secret, except by those who were actually fighting them. The Indonesians knew what we were doing, we knew what we were doing, but we hoped that nobody else did.
As soon as the Claret operation went over the border, there was a fake operation with an operation order and positions and orders on our side of the border. And that map was marked up. And the Claret, of course, was always kept covered. But this one was probably the press, and anyone could look at that one.
David Thompson, who commanded the 4th Royal Australian Regiment in Borneo in 1966. He later went into politics and became a minister in the Fraser government. David Thompson calls the Claret operations a masterpiece of political guile. It was his job to keep them secret, even from visiting cabinet ministers. This involved an elaborate system of faked records and dummy maps.
Yes, we had 2 maps in the operations room, one on our side of the border and one map on the other side of the border. The Claret map, the Claret operations on the other side of the border was always kept covered, and there was always a sentry on duty so people could get in to look at it. The press never saw it, with one exception.
I understand that you also had to keep it secret from a number of quite high-level political visitors, including the Attorney General at one point.
The Prime Minister, of course, knew. The Minister of Defence knew. And they were about the only ministers. We had other ministers who visited us, and so we took them into the public room and briefed them on operations our side of the border, all of which were fake, of course. And they didn't know. The ones that were cleared for Claret were given proper briefings. The ones that weren't cleared weren't given proper briefing. They were given the fake briefing.
If it had been blown in the Western media, then the Indonesians would have lost face, and that would have meant that they would have had to have fought a far more emphatic war than they were fought.
Here end of part 2